Hey guys, so let's talk a little bit about preparatory motion in piano technique. So preparatory motion is really helpful in the early stages or the beginning stages of piano playing to really teach the foundations of having a good coordinated technique, but it's also really helpful in a refined, robust technique at any stage in any amount of playing, any kind of repertoire, really. So in this video, I'm going to share 4 benefits to using preparatory motion in our playing when we are learning to develop the foundations of good technique. Okay, so first of all, let's just define preparatory motion. So preparatory motion is a motion that you make before doing something. So let's say you have a ball, you're going to throw it. You sort of wind up to throw, right? Or a frisbee, right? You wind to throw, right? That's a preparatory motion. And in piano playing, we could describe a lot of things as preparatory motion, but the primary, really big, sort of obvious preparatory motions would be if I lift my hand up in order to go down into the key. You could say if I lift my finger a little bit to go down, that's a smaller preparatory motion that we don't necessarily use all the time, but we could. But I'm not really going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about larger preparatory motions. Another thing in the Taubman approach, if you're familiar, they teach what's called a double rotation, which goes back to Tobias Mattei a long time ago. But that's this idea that we can rotate the arm like so, and then play a key like this. And it's like a preparatory sort of rotational movement. And Dorothy Taubman, as well as her successors, and now the Taubman, or the Golansky Institute, which is sort of the continuation of Dorothy Taubman's work, they have had great success using this kind of preparatory motion in their teaching. Now, I don't use that specific kind of, they call it a double rotation, preparatory motion, really, at least not much, because it's something that we have to take out of our technique later. And I find that to be counterintuitive. So the main preparatory motion that I use, and what we're really going to focus on today, is what I call up-down technique or gesture. And that's something that we always want to have in our technique. So like I said, beginning stages, excellent, but advanced stages, okay? So I still use this kind of up-down preparatory motion when I play because of the kind of ingredients or elements that it adds to my technique. So the preparatory motion that we're talking about here is, like I mentioned, the up-down technique. So it's this sort of technique to play a key. So I lift my arm and my hand in order to play a key. Now, when I teach beginners, which I teach a lot of beginners locally here in my piano studio, I always start them off this way. And there's different ways that I communicate this. But basically, I want them to lift their arm and just kind of drop into the keys like this. Now, I don't talk about weight. I don't talk about, being at rest at the key bed, because these things naturally start happening actually on their own. And that's what's so great about this kind of preparatory playing style, this up-down gesture technique that I use from the very start. So usually students start in the black keys, and they're just doing finger numbers, so no notation at this point, and they're just doing this, and they're learning to go up and down like so. All right, so let's talk about the 4 benefits to this. So number 1, it teaches the idea that the finger is just a natural conduit for the arm, or another way to think about that is that the finger goes all the way to the shoulder. There's been different people who have said this. There's some different famous teachers that have said this in the past. But this is sort of the idea, is that it's a natural conduit of the arm. So I never want them to play like this, where they're just sort of using the finger by itself. This is an unnatural way of playing, and it breeds tension and awkwardness in playing. And despite the fact that we look at someone with a robust technique and it kind of looks like they're doing that, they're actually not. You slow their playing down, you watch it, they're not really doing that. They're using more refined movements, rotation, etc. But ultimately, the finger is a natural conduit of the arm, just like Your legs is a natural conduit of the weight of your torso when you walk, okay? So they're not pushing the ground away from you, they're just supporting your weight, okay? So this is a very important thing to teach from the ground up, and it's really, really hard to use a finger sort of centric approach in playing when you have a teacher constantly telling you, no, lift your arm and go down like this, go down like this. Like I already mentioned, in addition to this basic idea that the finger is a natural conduit of the arm, it essentially, sort of pushes them in the direction of using weight, etc. So, and I usually don't have to say any of that. Now, that's sort of the same idea, but also kind of different, because you can use your finger as a natural conduit of your arm in a pushing motion with the arm and not weight, but usually the weight naturally comes in, so it's kind of like the same sort of idea, I guess, or benefit, if you will. So number 2 is that it teaches a natural kind of release. So a lot of times when people play, everything is just so tense all the time, and we always are on the surface of the keys. Usually students are afraid to just lift their hand and let go of the keyboard for a moment. It's so anxiety inducing that everything just gets so tense and tight. And if they, like, letting go is like impossible. Like teaching transfer students, middle school, high school kids, or even adults. And I'm like, okay, now just lift your hand. It's so hard to do that mentally, physically. It's just really challenging. And it's because we want to be like glued to the keyboard all the time. And what happens is your hand gets stuck in this really tight position. You're just trying to reach for everything instead of moving and having a more sort of organic approach to playing the piano. And so what happens is we naturally lift, and there's a little bit of release. Even if you don't see it, like, okay, now I'm obviously relaxed, even if you don't really see it, it naturally sort of happens, because we all sort of realize, subconsciously, that when I lift, there's no point in having this ball of tension here. And so usually, even without me saying anything about, okay, now let's just relax your hand, just make sure it feels loose, right? It just naturally happens, especially when it's from day one in lessons. So there's this natural kind of release that's really important. If we don't have that, it's not going to work. Obviously, when we play the piano, we use muscles. And if those muscles never have an opportunity to relax for a moment, release their tension, right, sort of lengthen and refresh, blood flows in, etc. They get a little breather, then they're just going to get tight. So we have to have that. Again, just like when we walk, our muscles are not constantly tense. They're shortened, tensed, and then they're lengthened, released. And it's just this back and forth sort of natural sort of thing. So really important. Number 3 is it teaches them this idea of being at rest at the key bed, okay? Again, I kind of already, I think, alluded to this, but I don't even have to say anything. I don't even have to say to them, okay, when you get to that key bed, make sure you're not pushing. I don't even want to use the word push, because I don't want that to be in their minds of like pushing this active sort of tense sort of thing. I want it to just be free and easy, where they just sort of drop their arm down, okay? Now, usually at first it's a little bit hard because they have to sort of figure out how much force they need to put the key down. But the more they do this, the more they do that, the easier and easier and easier it gets. And again, usually without me saying, they get to that point where they have the feeling, the sensation of being at rest at the bottom of the key, because they're just dropping their arm like this, going up and down, right? So they have this preparatory motion. Again, every time they have to play a note, they have to go up, right? And they don't have to go this high, obviously, but that's the idea. So again, I don't even usually have to say anything. It just sort of naturally happens. Occasionally I do, but it's really easy for them to get, versus if we're doing a finger-centric approach, it's really hard to get that feeling of being at rest at the key bed because of the way we're trying to play. Now, the 4th benefit is it teaches the vertical aspect of technique. Now, this is something that is oftentimes off-putting to people because it's very different to how they typically play. And it's this idea that the music on the written page is horizontal, right? It goes like this, and the keyboard goes like this. And that's this very natural movement of our arms side to side. And so we tend to think very, very horizontally when we play. So again, we never lift our arm, and we're always kind of going back and forth like this. And those muscles can actually get kind of overworked at times. But the other thing that happens is when we think in terms of technique very horizontally, what happens is it encourages reaching with the hand and reaching with the finger. And it, in a certain sense, discourages arm movement, and it encourages more reaching with the fingers. And so the hand and the fingers are very active. See, my hand is already getting tense. It already is very uncomfortable to do this. There's some movement in my arm, but it tends to encourage that. And I can say this, you know, having taught for almost 12 years, that this is 100% my experience teaching hundreds and hundreds of students. I mean, it just encourages this stretching and reaching sort of aspect. Now, on the flip side, if we focus more on the vertical aspect of playing the piano, so instead of thinking moving horizontally, let's say if I'm playing an octave or something, instead if I think going up and down, well, obviously there's a vertical aspect to this, but it actually discourages this idea of reaching, because if I'm going up, if I have to go up and then I have to come back down, it's very uncomfortable to try to reach like that. And students actually seem to realize it more, because subconsciously, again, they sort of go, well, that seems kind of superfluous to really reach like that. Versus if I'm doing this, it makes sense. Well, I don't have to move as much, see? And it feels more comfortable because I stay closer to the notes, I won't miss the notes. But when I do this, we sort of realize that there's no point, because I'm so far away from any of the notes. Any amount of reaching is not going to help. And what happens is they get used to this sort of thing and see how much more my arm is moving and how my fingers are reaching so much less. And so instead of thinking in terms of reaching and stretching and trying to get as close to those notes as possible and sort of preparing with the fingers, it discourages preparing with the fingers. It discourages reaching and stretching, and it encourages complete mobility of the arm. So if I'm trying to play this, even when I say, okay, over time my technique's getting more refined, I'm not going to do that really exaggerated up-down sort of motion. It just sort of teaches the hand that this is sort of the natural position, and I want to stay in this position as much as possible. So instead of trying to reach and stretch like so, now everything's really tight, I can be more in this position, and I have so much more mobility. Now obviously, as our technique gets more and more refined, we're not going to use this hugely exaggerated up-down sort of movements. But again, everything that I have, mentioned, the 4 different sort of benefits, and then other comments about those things, they're still important in a more refined, robust, advanced, or virtuosic sort of technique. So think about something like chord playing. Well, essentially, that is the same kind of technique, okay? My whole arm has to go down with my fingers, because otherwise it won't really work, okay? Think about octave playing, right? That's the same kind of up-down technique. Think about staccato playing. 90% of staccato playing is going to be a wrist staccato, in my opinion. And so what that is, that is essentially the same up-down technique. Think about repeated notes. Well, repeated notes, okay, again, in my opinion, from my technical perspective, mainly it's going to be, I have this little up-down. Now there's some rotation there, and obviously my fingers are moving, but the foundation of it is that same kind of technique. Thinking about, repeated chords, you know, whatever it is, you see that same kind of pulsing up and down sort of movement. And again, like I said, leaps. Anytime you're moving, it's an up, down, sort of arcing movement. It's not horizontal. This is like multiple movements. This feels like one movement. My arm comes up and it goes back down here. This feels like I play, I move, I play, right? And at speed, those additional movements, or the feeling of those additional movements, makes a huge difference, okay? So really important at any stage of learning, but specifically at the early stages, these 4 different things that we're developing are crucial later on for our technique. If you don't have a sense of being at rest at the key bed, okay, as an example, you will never really develop a really, really good, solid technique. This is incredibly important. If you don't know how, or you don't understand, or you can't, you know, use your fingers as a natural conduit of your arm, whether that's a movement or specifically weight in that sense, then you will struggle with a lot of different kinds of techniques. So really important to use preparatory motions in our piano playing. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure you leave a like and leave a comment down below. Always love hearing from you guys. Thanks so much. See you next time.